Hello and welcome to the Radiate Wellness Podcast with your host, metaphysician, Reiki master, and hypnotherapist, Christy Clemens Hoffman. Each week, we will discover teachings, tips, and tools to radiate your best life ever with practitioners, authors, and luminaries to help you on your path. Wellness, joy, peace, abundance. What do you want to radiate?
Hello and welcome back to the Radiate Wellness Podcast, where today we radiate resilience with Kristen Moeller, MS, who is a wildfire survivor, a speaker, former therapist, and author dedicated to helping others heal. Thank you so much for joining me today, Kristen. You've got quite a story.
Well, thank you. We're radiating resilience and my computer's going to fall. Thank you for having me here.
Yes, absolutely. Now, you are the author of a very interesting book here. It's called Phoenix Rising: Stories of Remarkable Women Walking Through Fire. So the stories of so many women who have been through cataclysmic events like you were.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So tell me about the wildfire. Now, this is not the wildfires in Los Angeles that we've been hearing about recently as of 2025, early in the year and late last year. This is a 2012 fire. So can you tell us?
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. And, the reason I'm bringing this book up now is because of those fires in California. Just wanting to, there's still not much out there about people telling their stories of walking through fire, as I say. So my book is actually a cooperation with a bunch of women, and I had a co-editor, co-author named Leslie, who she also lost her home in a fire in 2012, and we found each other through friends, and we were both writers, and we both had this common vision of trying to bring women together to tell their stories about how it was for them dealing with the Colorado wildfires over a period of years. So we're talking, mine was 2012, and I think we went back in time. We might have gone forward a little bit. And some of these women had lost their homes, like Leslie and I had. Some had witnessed others lose their homes, so kind of had this survivor's guilt of being the last house standing. That we had a 17-year-old and a 77-something-year-old. We had professional writers and those who had never written anything outside of school. We had a social worker and a firefighter. So we really had this nice collection of writers and people and different experiences and age ranges to look at these issues that people face when they're dealing with wildfire.
And you lost everything, right?
Yeah. It was crumbles. When you go to a scene after a fire has been through, and it looks like a war zone. I mean, because war zones look like that. It's just complete destruction and ashes and rubble and what I call artifacts kind of spread throughout. Find little shards of pottery, metal, kind of depending on the metal. Sometimes we had actually some candelabras that turned into rusted metal. They kind of have a thickened coat, but you can still see what they were. A lot of metal just melts. We actually had a little sailboat that we took on, just a little kind of 10 feet or shorter than that, just this little tiny thing that we would take on a lake near us. And its mast was made of, I think it's aluminum, and it made this stream of metal. Glass, kind of turns into glass will mix with things. So we had kind of clumps of glass and so mostly though it's rubble. You're picking through rubble.
Oh my goodness. I can't even imagine. Honestly, that is one of my greatest fears, is losing my home to fire. And I don't know how much it helps to know that you're not alone at all. And what type of resources were available to you when you lost your home?
Well, we were a small community, so by fire standards, we were a small fire, but we had 3 people who were killed in the fire, which is just for the amount of homes, and kind of 21 homes, which, as you know, we're talking in California, thousands and thousands, and we had 3 people. So for that's a pretty big number for that small of a fire. And they tragic. It was mismanaged when it was a whole bunch of things went wrong. First of all, it was a controlled burn that was caused by the Colorado State Forest Service, or lit by the Colorado State Forest Service. Now, controlled burns, I'm not anti-controlled burn. I'm anti-poor management of a controlled burn. So there's a period of time that they burn, and then they put it out, and they're supposed to monitor it for 3 days after they put it out. They only monitored it for 2 days after. So on the third day, we had one of the driest marches on record, and we had red flag warnings for wind, and it was just this perfect storm. And what happened was it just ignited some embers. And the next day, by the time they sent crews out, it was blowing up. They sent two guys in a pickup truck to look at it. And then obviously all went wrong. And then where the fire happened was one fire department, and where the houses were was another fire department. So there was also some confusion about who should respond. And then the 911, reverse 911 system malfunctioned. So none of us got calls. So this is what happened to these poor people who were stuck in their homes. Because where I lived, we were on the side of a mountain, and I could see it coming up the hill. Where they lived, they were kind of on the edge, and they couldn't see it. And there's a recording. It just makes me want to weep. There's a recording of one of the women that she called and was told that crews were on site, to not to worry. And she stayed in her house. And it was just awful. So these 21 homes, and we pulled together. We all had to have lawsuits because we had to fight the state of Colorado and fight legislation. And the legislation was, if the state was responsible for something happening like that, some kind of occurrence, there was a $500,000 cap per incident, as in for everyone. So $500,000 for 21 homes and 3 people dying. That's all the state was going to be responsible for. And we had to fight hard. We had to lawyer up. We had to testify in front of the House and the Senate in Denver. We had to really push the governor, like really push him with the media. We had one news station behind us that we would go on the news and talk about how the governor was not stepping up. And finally, he did. And finally, things started to move. So we had really come together as a group. And then our local community center had let us use their space for meeting. And then the community came together with donations. So there was a lot of support. So that was amongst ourselves too. But when you're dealing with it, everybody's dealing with it. So there's support in knowing you're not alone. And then there's sharing resources and ideas, but there's not the energy to really support. So the book was kind of born from, no one understands what it's like to be a wildfire survivor if you're not a wildfire survivor. I mean, you don't really understand, just like other types of losses. Unless you've really been through it, you don't completely know. And so the book was trying to reach communities that that kind of feel like they're lost in it, to say, hey, the 21 of us have been through this in some way, shape, or form, and we get you, we understand you. And here's a range of what 21 women experience.
Every region has its disasters. For Colorado, for California, other places on the West, it's the threat of wildfire, but there's also earthquake. And here in the Midwest, we have tornadoes. And then in the Southeast and the East Coast, we've got hurricanes, and then there's flooding. And, every place has its disasters and devastating ones. I remember my father's family lost everything in the 1951 Argentine flood in Kansas City, Kansas, and the whole town of Argentine was underwater. So this is not just unique to wildfire survivors. This is natural disaster survivors of every type. Now, you talk about the 21 women in the book. Are these all of the survivors of that community?
No, these are all different fires from different years. That summer, we had a few. It was a bad fire season. And then in that period of time, we had some really bad ones. Colorado has been very lucky, well, except for the horrible fire up near Louisville, which was our first real urban wildfire. And it was horrendous. The Marshall Fire, horrendous.
I had cousins who were through that.
Yeah, and it was a smaller version of what happens in California, but we have not been, California just gets hit. It's just the combination of Santa Ana winds and the urban wildland being
Yeah.
so close, the boundaries are so close. And
Mhm.
yeah, so every summer though, we all buckle up. It's just summer is the most beautiful time in Colorado, like absolutely. Although ours was March, ours was spring. I can't remember when that Marshall Fire was, and for anybody who's not doesn't know of it, it was I can't remember how many homes were lost, but it started in a very area, not in the mountains, not with heavily wooded area, and it just spread like crazy through these housing developments and just in businesses. And certainly we would have had people in that fire in our book, but obviously that was much later. We want to get this book in the hands like all those people. I always just say, well, even if you don't know someone who's lost a home or been impacted in California, send it to anyone you do know in California because I'm sure they know someone in California. Would love to just see this book get out there.
Right. The Marshall Fire was an immense fire. I remember that impacting members of my family and their friends and their community. But then also Northern Idaho, where a lot of my family lives, they have extreme wildfires. But anybody who's in a tornado zone and a flood zone and a hurricane zone, we all have these natural disasters and understanding the nature of community and resilience. And
Yeah, as far as fear level, though, I think tornadoes are hurricanes you can definitely prepare for.
Mhm.
Fires, you don't have it quite as much time. I probably was out 20 minutes before my house was consumed, and people were driving through dark clouds that looked like they were driving through night. And the earthquakes, also, of course, the big one. We don't know when that's going to happen or come, but tornadoes are really scary because of how unpredictable they are. And I'm glad you brought up all these other obviously subtle differences between loss and all of in those, but it's the same kind of thing. It's nature, whether it's man-made cause of our fire, but it's still nature and her wrath. And the tornadoes are really frightening.
Tornadoes do very, very strange things. The aftermath of a tornado is very different. Yeah. And that's a whole nother podcast episode, I'll tell you. Now, your book touches a lot on resilience and the power of resilience. And at least in your materials, you say that it's not simply bouncing back. So
Right.
if it's not just bouncing back, well, what is resilience? I don't want to take too much of your time, but I would like to ask you a few simple favors. First of all, please rate, review, and share this podcast wherever you're listening. It sounds like a simple little thing, and it is, but it has a huge impact for us because it helps other people find us in the podcasting algorithms. I don't know how it works, but I do know that it helps a lot. Next, if you would subscribe or follow wherever you're listening, whether that's YouTube or Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Pandora, Spotify, wherever you're listening, just hit subscribe or follow, and that helps you and it helps us. It helps you because then you receive notifications when we have a new episode that's out. It helps us because, again, algorithm magic, I don't know what happens, but it helps. And then finally, you can support our podcast in a tangible way by going to radiatewellnesscommunity.com/podcast and then click on support the show. Now, we have a new feature too. We are now on Patreon. You can find us on Patreon. You can also find the link to Patreon when you go to radiatewellnesscommunity.com/podcast. So on Patreon for $3 a month or $5 a month, you can support your metaphysical and spiritual growth. You can learn about upcoming guests and you can get early and ad-free versions of the shows. So please support us. This podcast is free for you to listen, but we have costs and quite frankly, they come out of my pocket. So if you like this content, if you get a lot out of it, please see what you can do to give back. Thank you so much.
Yeah, because I really dislike the whole bouncing back concept. I think it does a huge disservice to our grief process and lays these expectations on how we will be around grief. And just so unfair and such a disservice as a culture that what we've done with it. And, always kind of reward, say, wow, she's doing so well after this, fill in the horrendous blank there. And it's why does it have to be that you're doing so well? I just talked to a friend yesterday who lost her dad, and she was present for his death. And it was he had dementia, and it was a really terrible decline, pretty fast decline. I lost my father to dementia as well, but my father's was still terrible, but it was a longer, extended, and her dad just went down really fast. So there was so much as you're going through that, and then to be present for his death. And she was saying, I don't have time to cry. And she said, I just recently talked to a friend who had just lost her dad, and we both started to tear up, but then stopped. And I'm thinking, why do we have to do that? Why can't we just lose it? It's like that whole wearing a black armband for a period of time so people know that person's in mourning. I'm going to treat that person kindly, and I'm going to touch in with my own losses and know what it's like. So I think the bounce back thing is just our achievement oriented drive culture. And the resilience is something that's deeper. It's something that's important that we know that we have it, because I've been talking about this a lot, obviously. When you're in the moment, you don't know you have it. I've been through now, the fire was a major turning point in my life. It was really a major, major turning point. There's before the fire and after the fire. But I've also had even harder things to deal with, like a lot of things, struggles and health issues and all sorts of things. And a couple of years ago, I was experiencing something that was really, really challenging. And it was testing everything I had. And at the time, I did not think, wow, I'm so resilient. But I had to really kind of slow it down and think, okay, are you okay right now? And try to just be in the moment right now, one foot in front of the other, one step at a time, right now. And then you can look back and you can see resilience. So I think it's something you have to kind of show to yourself. But if you don't feel like you're resilient, then do look back now at the things you've walked through, the heartbreaks, the heartaches, the losses, the illnesses, the deaths, all of those things, whether it's from losing a parent, losing a spouse, losing a child, losing a pet, which is one of my up there with my worsts. Okay, I've walked through that and I'm still here. And the things that do make us stronger, although then add in when you lose something with a natural disaster, it can also add, as any loss or any trauma can add in the post-traumatic trauma response. When's the other shoe going to drop kind of feeling? So that's a whole nother piece. But resilience can still be in there. So I have had to just remind myself, you made it through this, you made it through that. So it's a beautiful word and something that's true. And it doesn't have to look like the hero's journey that we imagine, where you overcome and then you rise victorious. And I have a phoenix tattoo on my arm. That's like the phoenix had to rise again and again and again. And I think she rose sometimes with her wings a little crispy.
Yeah. And now you have taken that message of the power of resilience and you've turned it into navigating grief and trauma and sharing strategies for that. Can you share any of that work with us?
Yeah, and it's kind of, what I was just talking about, where as a therapist, I worked with trauma, and as a human, I've been through trauma. And most people have been through some form of trauma, understanding that if you've been through trauma, when more trauma happens, it triggers all the trauma, just like grief. Grief, when you go through triggers all the grief, and all sorts of things might bubble up that don't completely belong. And it's okay, that's fine, but it can just feel completely overwhelming. So finding ways to keep yourself grounded and remember, there's something, I was doing a meditation this morning and it was saying something about, it's like a really good journal prompt. In those moments when you're completely lost and feel like just the weight of everything, whether it's grief or trauma, what would you have wanted from someone? And it's not a way to say, oh, well, my husband didn't give it to me and my friends can't be there, but to kind of, I imagined like someone kind of like a weighted blanket, just putting their weight on top of me and just kind of holding me there. And that felt like, I really like weighted blankets, by the way. I have a weighted and I sleep with a weighted blanket. I have a little travel size. Because for me, what happened was I've done work on myself since 1989. I've been on a path of spiritual growth since then, got into recovery from an eating disorder and gave up alcohol and drugs at that time, and then became a therapist shortly after. And I've been doing work and personal growth ever since. There are moments, times when I've taken breaks and I do have a life like I do, but it is my life. Personal growth is my field. But what happened for me is I kept over the years thinking, why do I work so hard yet still struggle as much as I do? For the amount of work that I do, how hard it still feels doesn't feel equal. And it just was this massive mystery for the longest time. And then, very long story short, in 2021, I had a memory emerge of early childhood abuse from a non family member. And it was something that never, ever, ever, what occurred to me was my symptoms kind of showed maybe there was some abuse in my past. And therapists had said that to me very gently in the past. But when I checked in about it, I thought, no, there's no way. And I worked in that field, and no, I wouldn't not remember something like that. Well, it turns out I did not remember. My psyche closed it all down because I was probably 4 or 5. And so these memories started to come to the surface. And it led to a mental health crisis where it was too much for my system, but it showed up in physical. In the physical, it showed up as massive anxiety, which led to insomnia, which led to had tinnitus for a long time, probably 20 years, but it spiked. And when I had no sleep, high anxiety, and a tinnitus spike, it just completely sent my nervous system off, just completely. And I was having trouble functioning. I could function, but I was close to an edge that felt really scary. I mean, my function was crying and sobbing, and it's something like, what does it mean to not function? But I'm sharing this just to say I'm someone who has experienced this. And so I think depending on where you are in your grief/trauma healing process, there are different needs at different times. I needed some serious help at that point. Like I needed a team and I needed serious help. And I actually went to a trauma treatment center where I could be fed. I'm very slender and I've always been slender, even though with my eating disorder, I couldn't see that. But I dropped 15 pounds without even knowing it, I've never done that. I was just skeletal and I was eating, but the weight wasn't staying on. My system was in total overwhelm. I had to do that level of care where I went someplace where I could be fed, where I had healthy food and I could do holistic activities and yoga and meditation and walk and be in nature, but also have counseling and be out of my environment with people that were trained to deal with that. Not my poor husband at home wondering what to do with me, his once very, very strong wife, now a puddle on the floor, crying like, I don't know if I can do this, and feeling suicidal. There's that level. And I'm not laughing because it wasn't funny, but in 12-step programs, we laugh a lot about, it's part of what saves us is to have a little laugh at, like I just did. So there's that level to milder levels, and at milder levels like meditation and journaling and walking and slowing it down, paying attention to your nervous system, really good eating well, eating healthy, getting professional help, therapists, support groups. There are free support groups around, so finding some kind of support group or a group of friends who you really trust, or one friend who you really trust if you don't have a group that you can really talk to. Books that tell stories of things that people have walked through, things that you're walking through, from so minor to major and everywhere in between. There are a lot of tools, and unfortunately still we can say we're much more friendly about mental health issues in our society. And I think we are in a lot of ways, but we also are not. There's still a stigma. I don't share like, oh, so what'd you do the summer of 23? Oh, I went to a trauma treatment center. It's not what I bring up at a dinner table conversation with a new group of people. But if I can trust someone, and obviously I'm trusting you and your whole audience, I'm doing it for a purpose because I want to say, I crawled out of something. There were serious times. Every other thing I've walked through in my life, I knew I could get through. Maybe an early recovery, but before went into treatment when I was 23 in 1989, I didn't feel as bad then as I felt in summer of 23. At that point, I didn't really know if I could stop my bulimia because I had tried. So I didn't know that I could. I didn't really believe that I could. But pretty soon, when I got into treatment and started trusting the meal plan and trusting the process, it started to work
Mm.
pretty fast. But in summer of 23, it was not like that. It was like I was holding on for dear life because I didn't want to die, but I didn't want to live like that. It was really, really bad.
That's a lot. We all have something that we're dealing with. So this is a very universal thing. It may not be bulimia, and it may not be a wildfire that devastates our community, but we all have something that we're dealing with. So I think these messages are universal. We've all had abuse or trauma of some form, some shape along the way.
Yeah, one of my dear friends who I'd love to have her on your podcast, her name is Sally McQuillan, and she just wrote a book called Reaching for Beautiful. And it is an amazing story. It fits somewhere in the world between your two podcasts because her son Christopher died in an accident when he was 21, and she calls him her angel child. And there's nothing worse than a mother losing a child. Like, I just think this is where I'm getting emotional about it just now, and I don't have children. I have my dog who's the love of my life. Sally and I were talking recently about that, those moments when you are by yourself and it's the middle of the night and it's just that heaviness when you can't sleep, when it's all right there. Because for me, those are the worst times. I can function pretty well in the daytime, but it's at night when the voices come in and if I can't sleep and all of that. And I said, what do you do? We were just discussing, and she doesn't have a pat answer, but it is her resilience is one step at a time. And then her spiritual connection to her son has been what's kept her going. But she's also acknowledged that there are times where she doesn't want to keep going. She hasn't wanted to keep going, but she does keep going. And she has two more children and she wouldn't do that to them and like all the things. And she's a therapist and she has massive tools, but it's those middle of the night. And you could not be in the middle of a big loss right now and still have those kind of moments. If you've got depression or anxiety or whatever, or your boyfriend or girlfriend just left you or whatever it is, could have those moments of just that utter aloneness. And I think I want to share about mine because I want other people to know, okay, I'm not the only one who experiences this. Those we should have a name for it. I'll try to come up with one, like the middle of the night. I don't want to call it crazies. That was what first came to my mind, but it's like middle of the night voices. It's like something, the middle of the night darkness. I mean, that's where you look at resilience. You look at like, okay, I've survived this many nights before. I've walked through this many things before. And yes, this feels like I can't go on right now, but I'm going to choose in this moment to just go on. And I think that's like, we didn't come on this podcast to talk about tinnitus, but it isn't, you know.
I've got it too.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I got to ask you about that in a minute because, well, as you know, you probably know, I was habituated. So when I first got it, I was at an outdoor concert, an a cappella band of all things, an a cappella band. And you're going to love this. Okay, ready for this one?
Huh?
I feel like we're just like girlfriends sitting around. This is how I would.
That's what I love about this podcast.
I know, and I liked you from the beginning, right when I got on. Yeah. So I was at this concert and I love this band. They're called Face and they're out of Boulder and they're five guys and they just have beautiful voices and they do a lot of cover songs. And I was standing up near the speakers and they sang my favorite song, which is Calling All Angels, that they do, right? So Calling All Angels, and it was distorting when he, like in the high note, it was distorting. And the distortion bothered my ears. And then that night, it started ringing. And at first I was scared. And I'm talking, this was probably 20 years ago. So first I was scared. But pretty quickly, it's like they say with tinnitus, it's like your refrigerator makes a hum, but nobody really notices the refrigerator hum until it goes out of whack and then you notice it. With tinnitus, a lot of times we can be habituated until something happens like what happened with me, where it became my nervous system all of a sudden started reacting to it again like it was a threat. But this time, because my whole system was in such alarm, it didn't settle down. And now we're talking coming up on 2 years later. It's still, I wear hearing aids that play a tone that help to rehabituate to it, which is very helpful. Unfortunately, I went on all these Facebook groups about tinnitus and dealing with tinnitus, and there are all these suicidal people who are just saying, I can't do it. I mean, we're talking Marines and rock people, like people who play a lot of music, like these big, tough people, and saying, I don't think I can live anymore. It's driving me too crazy. And it's because your nervous system thinks it's a threat. And still thinking about this show as I was getting ready, I had a little, my anxiety was a little bit up, and then it feels louder. So I'm still not completely habituated. It's not driving me over the edge like it was that summer. If it hadn't been for the tinnitus, I would have been okay. I wouldn't have had to go to treatment because I was just been dealing. It was hard, but when the tinnitus spiked, it was too much. So I feel for you. What is yours like?
It's constant and it's loud. And I don't know. I try to ignore it as best I can. It's hard, you know?
Yeah. Hmm.
And I think anxiety does make it worse.
It does.
And
Yeah.
and we are in that kind of fearful, anxious 3 o'clock in the morning moment. That's when it seems to really ramp up. And so
Yeah.
trying to be resilient, and we can't really move past it, but move through it and become habituated to it. What I like about your book and this concept for this book and the survivor stories is that when we're in this very anxious period and when things are really bad and we're going through the worst of things, just being able to know that other people are in there with you as well. And I don't know, for me, it seems if somebody else comes up to me and is telling me about their problems and their issues, and all of a sudden I'm like, I'm on caretaker mode. I want
Right.
to talk to them about how are you feeling? How are you dealing with that? What can I do? And that eases my anxiety.
Yeah.
And that's a universal
Completely.
thing.
Yeah.
But with books
Yeah.
like yours, that this can be one of the wonderful benefits is that we feel like we're switching into this caretaker mode, making sure that everybody's
Right. Although we do know too, and I'm sure you know this, we can't go too far because that was part of what led to the memory emerging was having been in a complete codependent issue with my brother who had been in some deep trouble and giving my all and going completely into trying to help rescue, do everything I could. And I gave away, and it's my tendency anyway. I've been kind of a caretaker personality all my life, thus the helping professions. But it was this feeling completely depleted. And then I was depleted, and that was in 2021. And then I started having health issues, and then I had the memory emerge. So it was caretaking. Yes, what you're saying is so true. And that's right, with limits, right?
with
Don't go
limits.
into yeah, because I mean, that's why the 12-step programs also work so well, is because the lesson is get out of yourself, go help someone else, see what you can bring. My sponsor would always say, see what you can bring to a situation. Don't go looking for what you can get out of it. But for many of us who are the codependent, leaning, caretaking types, we can exhaust ourselves and make ourselves sick. And then the body takes over and says, no, we won't be doing this anymore.
Right. It can be like we reach our limit, our
Yeah.
summation there. Yeah. I want to mention that you've written other books as well. So it's not
Yes.
just Phoenix Rising. So can you run us through some of your other books that you've written?
I would love to. Yeah. Part of my life story was growing up with very artistic and talented parents. My mother was a very talented artist, and my father was art historian and taught art at Duke and then was a curator of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And so I grew up with what was creativity. And I thought, this is what good art is. And I just thought I didn't have creativity. I didn't think I had the capability. And I tried in various ways, but I would just stop because I just compared myself to my mother and came up short. And she never laid that on me, but her work was all around our house and her blue ribbons and she was very, very beautiful, movie star beautiful. So part of my issue was to not feel any of the above, just to feel less than and couldn't do it. And so I just didn't imagine myself as someone who had this creative spark. And it wasn't until way later in life. Like I got my master's in counseling early, and I felt like I could do one thing at a time like that, have a goal and then achieve the goal. But as far as creation, it wasn't until 2008 that I had an inspiration for a book kind of out of the blue. It's too long a story to tell here, but the book is called Waiting for Jack. And I caught myself waiting literally for Jack Canfield as I had a connection with him. And I became obsessed with that I was not going to hear back from him with the email and becoming like, when's he going to email me? When's he going to email me? And I thought, why am I waiting for Jack? And it was like, boom, waiting for Jack. I'm going to write a book called Waiting for Jack about why we wait in life. Because it was Jack of Hearts was about relationships. Jack of all trades was about career and purpose. You Don't Know Jack was about letting go of all we think we know and practicing beginner's mind. So I had this kind of idea and then chapter download. And I had enough stick-to-itiveness at that point in my life that I thought, I am going to do this. I am going to do this. And I surrounded myself with people who believed in me, hired a coach to work with me, accountability. And I read the book on how to write a book proposal, and wrote a book proposal. And it was painful. I mean, I would lay sometimes on the floor just like, I can't do this. All sorts of adventures. But I got that published, and Jack Canfield wrote my foreword for that book.
Yes, that's so exciting. For
And
those who are not familiar, Jack Canfield is of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series.
yes, and he is just a lovely man. And later I became friends with him, and then friends with his wife, and then coached his wife in writing her book, and have spent time at their house. And so it opened up this whole new avenue that I had just not considered. But I had to kind of start to deal with, okay, going from not being a writer to allowing myself to be first an author. Because I think writer is like developing the craft. And so at first I felt like, okay, I'm an author. And then I had a radio show for a little while during that period when I was very out there in the world. And I had this publisher on, and she said, I love your story. I love what you're doing. I'd love to do a rewrite of Waiting for Jack, but I want to kind of update it. And we're going to remove all the Jack stuff. And we're just going to call it, What Are You Waiting For? And so that was a book. I got a publishing deal for that. But then my house burned down. So then I wanted to write about grief and losing a house. And she said, no, this is what publishers do. I'm a literary agent, so I can say this with authority, is publishers will say, no, this is what we contracted you for this book. So we're doing this book. And if you want to do this book, or if you don't want to do this book, then we're not doing a book. So it was a rewrite, but I pulled in all these stories. I had blogged after the fire as one of my coping mechanisms. And I blogged about 100,000 words, and which is a lot of words, as any writer will know. And I pulled a lot of that content into that book. So that's called What Are You Waiting For? So that's probably my most well-produced book.
Yeah.
But I'm working on 2 other books right now. I'm working on a memoir, and that kind of is a catch up for all my summer of 23 and that whole story of mental health crisis. And then I'm also working on a book that helps other writers write their books, and working on a coaching program about that, because I've been doing that for a long time, but now I'm finally just pulling it all together. So I like to help other people find their creativity. I love working with people who maybe don't believe that they have it, that were like me. They don't believe they're creative. They don't think they can do it. They don't think they can write, but they have to have the burning desire. And I love helping people have that breakthrough into seeing their words on a page.
There is nothing like putting your words on a page and really seeing the power of what you have to say.
Mm-hmm. There's nothing like it.
Right. And I'm looking at your website, and you've got all of these books that you have worked on with others, and then how to work with you in terms of author coaching and author representation. And this is not at all what I thought we'd be getting into, but my gosh, it's when we have a story that's as compelling as yours, and you've got multiple stories that are compelling. You've got the wildfire and losing everything, but also this dark summer of the soul in 2023, and going to the trauma treatment center and knowing that, hey, I need help. That you've got stories, we've all got stories. And to my point earlier, it helps others when we share our stories, and then getting people's stories out there in the world. I think it's a wonderful thing. So your website is kristenmoeller.com. This will be in the show notes, so don't worry about spelling it. So there'll be a link in the show notes. And is there anything we have not talked about, I haven't mentioned, that you think is important for our audience to know?
Well, I think we have covered quite a few topics. And like you said, I don't know what's going to happen, but I think a combination of the day, whatever, but your space that you create, and just feeling such a kinship with you, that I've kind of briefly mentioned summer of 23 on, I think, one other podcast, but did not discuss like I just did. So thanks for being the space for that. And I think we've covered enough, but I would say the biggest thing I'm learning. The simple lesson, we've heard this before, but being gentle and being compassionate with ourselves it's where it's at. If we could just do that, it's a good day.
Right. We can be gentle with ourselves all the time. So thank you so much for joining me today, Kristen. It has been an absolute pleasure. I would love to have you back on with a future book, with future events. I'd love to have you back on in the future.
Right. I would love that. Thank you so much.
You don't know what to watch next? Decisions. Well, we've got some suggestions. You can click this little video here and watch that. It's something that we think you're going to like. If you like the last one, you're going to like that one too. You can also click on the subscribe button. And if you do that, then you'll get notifications whenever we have a new video up. Win-win, right?